My mother looked me dead in the eye across the mahogany dining table and told me to go live like junk. All because I refused to drain my life savings to fund my sister and her $15,000 spiritual healing retreat in Tulum. She gave me an ultimatum to either pay up or pack my bags and get out of their basement. I chose the bags. I bought a boarded-up house at a county tax auction for exactly $800. They laughed at my pile of rotting wood and told me I was throwing my life away. But they stopped laughing when they found out what was hiding inside the walls and suddenly demanded their share of the millions. I am Simone. I am 35 years old, and I work as an architectural consultant. For as long as I can remember, I have been the designated financial cushion for my family and their reckless behavior. Before I dive into exactly how I turned an $800 mistake into a $1 million empire and watched my greedy family implode, take a second to let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever been the family scapegoat who finally decided to stop playing their game and build your own table instead. The dinner took place at my parents' house on a rainy Sunday evening. It was supposed to be a regular family meal in their formal dining room, the kind of room that always felt more like a museum display than a place for a family to actually connect and share love. The long, heavy mahogany table was set perfectly with my mother Brenda and her expensive fine china. But nobody was eating. Instead, my 32-year-old sister Jasmine was putting on the performance of a lifetime. Jasmine is a self-proclaimed lifestyle influencer. Her entire online brand is built on presenting a flawless, wealthy aesthetic to her thousands of followers. She posts daily about luxury skincare, high-end fashion, and manifesting abundance. But behind the camera filter, she is completely drowning in massive credit card debt. She sat across from me, dramatically sobbing into her expensive linen napkin. Her perfectly manicured acrylic nails gripped her phone so tightly, her knuckles were turning white. Her premium credit card had just been declined while she was trying to book a luxury beachfront villa in Tulum, Mexico. She called it a much-needed spiritual healing retreat to realign her chakras and find her inner peace. I called it a $15,000 vacation she absolutely could not afford. Jasmine wailed loudly about how her aura was deeply blocked and how her sponsors were expecting fresh organic content from the white sand beaches of Tulum. She claimed her mental health was rapidly deteriorating because the universe was testing her financial boundaries and limiting her potential to shine bright in the digital world. My mother Brenda immediately rushed to her side. Brenda is 60 years old and utterly obsessed with appearances. She treats Jasmine like absolute royalty because Jasmine gives her bragging rights at her weekly country club brunches. Brenda loves telling her friends about her beautiful internet-famous daughter. Brenda gently stroked Jasmine and her perfectly styled hair, and cooed at her, telling her that everything would be all right, and that the universe always provides a way for special people like her. Then the universe in my mother and her eyes suddenly shifted its demanding gaze directly to me. Brenda turned her sharp, calculating glare in my direction. The motherly warmth completely vanished from her face in an instant, replacing it with cold, rigid expectation. She looked at me the exact same way she always did whenever a massive bill needed to be paid or a financial mess needed to be cleaned up quietly. Growing up, I was always the invisible child. While my parents proudly displayed Jasmine and her cheerleading trophies and pageant crowns in the living room, my academic awards and architectural drafting certificates were quietly filed away in a dusty cabinet. I learned very early on that love in this family was highly conditional. It was given freely to the child who made them look good to the neighbors, and it was withheld from the child who actually did the hard work to keep the family afloat. I accepted my role because I believed that one day they would eventually see my worth. I thought if I just worked hard enough and provided enough financial support, they would finally love me the way they loved Jasmine. But sitting in their cold, drafty basement night after night studying historic zoning laws and preservation guidelines, I slowly realized that my worth to them was only measured by the balance in my bank account. I had spent the last 3 grueling years living in that damp basement space. I paid them exorbitant rent every single month faithfully without complaining. I worked 80-hour weeks traveling to historic sites and managing massive restoration projects for wealthy clients. I saved every single penny I earned because I desperately wanted to buy my own property and start my own preservation firm. I lived and breathed historic homes. My savings account was my literal ticket to freedom and true independence. It was absolutely not an endless charity fund for my sister and her fake spiritual awakening. "Simone, you need to help your sister right now," Brenda demanded. Her voice left absolutely no room for debate or negotiation. It was an order from a commander to a foot soldier. She has been under so much tremendous stress lately building her brand, and you know how fragile she gets. You have that massive savings account just sitting there doing absolutely nothing. Transfer 15,000 to her account right now so she can secure this villa booking before it completely sells out. This is a spiritual emergency for your sister. I sat there looking at the two of them in utter disbelief. My father Calvin was sitting quietly at the head of the table, methodically cutting his steak. He is 62 years old and has spent his entire marriage avoiding conflict at all costs. He never once intervened to defend me. He just kept his head down, chewed his food, and let Brenda run the show completely unchecked. The entire dining room grew suffocatingly silent as they waited for my immediate compliance. Jasmine peeked out from behind her damp linen napkin, fully expecting me to sigh, pull out my phone and open my mobile banking app just like I had done dozens of times before to bail her out of trouble. But this time was fundamentally different. Something inside me had finally permanently snapped. Years of being treated like an automated teller machine rather than a human being rushed to the surface. But I kept my composure perfectly intact. I did not argue with them. I did not raise my voice or start crying. I did not try to logically explain the profound value of hard work and financial responsibility to people who only understood entitlement and emotional manipulation. I simply picked up my crystal glass of ice water and took a very slow, deliberate sip, feeling the cold water calm my nerves and steady my heartbeat. Then I reached into my heavy leather purse, sitting on the floor beside my chair. I dug past my measuring tape and my architectural scale ruler. I pulled out a slightly wrinkled piece of official paper. It was a county tax auction receipt that I had received just a few hours prior after standing in line at the City Hall courthouse. I flattened the paper out with the palm of my hand and slid it across the polished mahogany table. It glided smoothly until it rested right in front of my mother and her untouched dinner plate. I looked right into Brenda and her furious, impatient eyes, and I spoke softly, but with absolute, unshakable firmness that echoed through the quiet room. I cannot give her $15,000. I just bought a house for $800. The silence in the dining room hung in the air for exactly 3 seconds before it was completely shattered by a loud, obnoxious bark of laughter. It came from Trent. Trent is 34 years old, and he is my sister Jasmine and her husband. He is a white man who wears tailored vests over expensive designer t-shirts and confidently calls himself a crypto entrepreneur. In reality, he loses money daily on digital coins while aggressively lecturing the rest of us on financial literacy at every family gathering. He leaned back in his heavy wooden chair, wiping a fake tear of amusement from his eye as he looked across the table at me. $800, he gasped, shaking his head as if I had just told the funniest joke he had ever heard. What exactly did you buy, Simone? A damp cardboard box under the downtown overpass? Or did you finally secure that premium crack den in the slums? I stared at him, maintaining my calm exterior, even though my blood was beginning to boil. You are an architectural consultant, Simone, he continued, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. You look at old blueprints and pick out matching crown molding for a living. You are not some real estate miracle worker. You cannot fix a condemned trap house. And you definitely cannot afford to throw your money away on garbage when you are currently living in your parents' basement. He looked around the table, grinning widely, as if he had just delivered a comedic masterpiece, expecting everyone to join in on the mockery. What Trent conveniently left out of his little stand-up routine was the actual reality of my living situation. It was true that I lived in my parents' basement, but I was not a freeloader. I paid them $2,000 a month to live in that unfinished concrete space. My rent money single-handedly covered my parents' entire monthly mortgage. Meanwhile, Trent and Jasmine lived in a luxury downtown loft featuring floor-to-ceiling windows and a private rooftop terrace. A loft that my father had co-signed the lease for and completely paid the down payment on because Trent had ruined his own credit score betting on internet money. Jasmine gasped, clutching her chest as if I had physically struck her across the face. She looked at the county tax receipt on the table like it was a venomous snake. "You bought a ruined house," she cried out, her voice shrill and trembling with fresh tears. "With the money you absolutely knew I needed for my retreat. How could you be so incredibly selfish, Simone? I am literally having a severe spiritual crisis. My personal brand is suffering because I am energetically misaligned. I need to be at that cacao ceremony and sound bath in Tulum by Friday, and you are throwing away cash on a literal garbage dump in the ghetto." She made it sound as though my investment in my own future was a direct and violent attack on her well-being. Brenda slammed her hands flat down on the mahogany table, causing the fine china plates and crystal water glasses to rattle sharply. Her face was flushed dark with absolute rage. She did not care about my career goals. She did not care about my deep knowledge of historic properties or my dreams of starting my own preservation firm. She only cared that her reliable ATM machine had just firmly declined her transaction. "You listen to me, and you listen closely," Brenda hissed, her voice dropping to a dangerous, menacing whisper that commanded the room. "You are not buying any property. You are going to take your phone out of your purse right now and cancel whatever ridiculous tax auction check you just wrote. Then, you are going to wire your sister the $15,000 she needs for this trip. If you refuse to support this family, when we desperately need you, then you can pack your bags and get out of my house tonight." The threat hung heavily in the air. She expected me to instantly fold. She expected me to apologize and beg to stay because that was the dynamic she had carefully cultivated for 35 years. I shifted my gaze away from her angry face and looked directly at my father. Calvin had completely stopped cutting his steak. He was staring intensely at his porcelain plate, absolutely refusing to make eye contact with me. This was the man who taught me how to read measuring tapes when I was 7 years old. The man who told me I could build anything I set my mind to. Now he was just a silent coward, allowing his wife to throw his eldest daughter out onto the street in the middle of a freezing rainstorm, all over a fake spiritual vacation for his youngest child. "Dad," I asked quietly, making sure my voice remained perfectly steady, "are you really going to let her do this?" Calvin finally looked up. He swallowed hard, adjusted the collar of his shirt, and let out a heavy sigh. "Just do what your mother says, Simone," he muttered, looking away again. "Do not make things harder than they need to be tonight. Your sister needs this trip." That was it. The final frayed thread connecting me to this toxic family cleanly and permanently snapped. The last ounce of hope I held that they might one day respect me completely evaporated into the cold dining room air. I did not feel sad anymore. I only felt a sharp, icy clarity. I stood up slowly, pushing my heavy wooden chair back against the hardwood floor. I picked up my leather purse and carefully slid the county tax auction receipt safely back into the side pocket. I smoothed down the front of my shirt and looked at my mother. "I will have all of my things out of the basement in exactly 1 hour," I said evenly. Brenda scoffed, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. She looked me up and down, with pure, unadulterated contempt, completely shocked that her ultimate threat had backfired, but too proud to ever back down. "Go live like junk," then she spat her words laced with venom. "Go freeze in your $800 shack in the absolute worst part of the city. But do not come crying to me when the roof caves in on you, and you realize you are absolutely nothing without our roof over your head." I did not give her the satisfaction of a response. I did not slam any doors or yell any insults. I simply turned my back, walked out of the formal dining room, and headed straight down the stairs into the cold concrete basement. I moved with military precision. I packed my clothes, my drafting tools, my architectural reference books, and my heavy winter coats into 4 large canvas duffel bags and a pair of heavy plastic storage bins. I left behind the cheap furniture I had bought to make the space livable. I only took what truly belonged to me. I carried my heavy bags up the stairs and out the side door, loading everything into the back of my SUV, while the freezing rain poured down from the black night sky, soaking through my clothes. The house remained completely silent. No one came out to help me. No one came to the door to stop me or say goodbye. I slammed the trunk shut, wiping the cold rain from my face. I climbed into the driver's seat, turned the key in the ignition, and blasted the heater. I put the car in drive and pulled out of their perfectly manicured driveway, heading into the dark storm. I was homeless, but for the first time in my entire life, I was completely free. I drove through the relentless downpour, navigating away from the sprawling, manicured lawns of my parents' upscale suburb. The smooth, freshly paved roads gradually gave way to cracked, uneven asphalt and flickering amber streetlights. I was heading deep into the heart of the city, into a historically red-lined neighborhood that the local government had purposely neglected for over half a century. To people like Trent and my mother, this area was nothing but a punchline. They viewed it as a dangerous wasteland, a place they would only ever lock their car doors and speed through if they took a wrong turn. But to me, as a historic architectural consultant, this specific neighborhood was a forgotten goldmine. It was originally built in the late 1800s and later became a thriving hub for affluent Black families, before systemic zoning laws and economic starvation choked the resources out of the community. I knew the deep, rich history of these streets. I knew the value hidden beneath the surface-level decay. I pulled my SUV up to the cracked curb and put the car in park, leaving the headlights shining through the heavy rain. There it stood. My $800 mistake, according to my family. The Victorian shell loomed in the dark, heavily boarded up and covered in layers of aggressive neon graffiti. The front porch sagged dangerously under the weight of rotting timber, and overgrown dead ivy choked the massive brick foundation. Rain lashed against my windshield as I sat there staring at the imposing structure. Any normal person would have cried at the sight of it. They would have seen an insurmountable mountain of garbage and immediately regretted their life choices. I did not cry. I just felt a deep, powerful surge of adrenaline. I popped the trunk and grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight, turning it on before stepping out into the freezing storm. I dragged my heavy canvas duffel bags and plastic storage bins through the muddy, overgrown yard and up the creaking porch stairs. I had to use a heavy pair of iron bolt cutters from my tool bag to snap the rusted padlock securing the front door. Pushing the massive solid oak door open required throwing my entire body weight against the wood. The inside smelled of damp earth, decades of undisturbed dust, and complete abandonment. I clicked my flashlight to its highest setting and swept the bright beam across the front parlor. Strips of peeling floral wallpaper hung loosely from the tall walls like dead vines. Piles of mysterious debris and shattered plaster littered the original hardwood floor. The temperature inside the house was somehow colder than the freezing rain outside. The damp air cut right through my clothes. There was no electricity. There was no running water. There was certainly no heat. I hauled all of my belongings inside, dropping them in the center of the massive room. I was shivering violently and soaked completely to the bone. My expensive leather boots were caked in thick, heavy mud. I unrolled a thick thermal sleeping bag right there in the middle of the dusty floorboards. It was a very far cry from the heated, finished basement I had just been kicked out of. But as I sat down on the sleeping bag, shining my light around the cavernous, empty room, the crushing, suffocating weight of my family and their endless financial demands completely vanished. In my parents' house, I was always walking on eggshells, waiting for the next crisis, the next demand for money, or the next cruel comment about my life choices. The polished marble floors of their home hid decades of emotional rot and manipulation. This house was the exact opposite. The rot was completely visible, but the foundation beneath it was honest and incredibly strong. The silence in this broken house was not a punishment. It was a much-needed sanctuary. I was entirely alone, but for the first time I felt completely safe. I could have gone to sleep right then and there. I was physically exhausted and emotionally drained from the brutal confrontation at the dinner table. But my professional curiosity and my restless energy would not let me lay down just yet. I reached into my heavy canvas tool bag and pulled out a solid crowbar. The cold metal felt grounding in my hands. I walked over to the massive front bay window, which had been completely sealed off by thick rotting plywood from the outside and the inside. I jammed the curved, heavy end of the crowbar deep into the tight gap between the interior wood panel and the original window frame. I braced my muddy boots against the plaster wall and pulled back with all of my upper body strength. The rusted ancient nails shrieked and groaned in loud protest as the wood slowly began to splinter and give way. I hit the crowbar again and again, driving it deeper into the crevice. I channeled every single ounce of anger and frustration from the dinner table into my swings. I thought about Trent and his mocking laugh. I thought about Jasmine and her fake spiritual tears. I thought about my mother telling me to go live like junk. With one final deafening crack, the entire heavy sheet of plywood gave way and crashed violently onto the floorboards, sending up a massive, suffocating cloud of dust into the cold air. I coughed aggressively, waving the thick debris away from my face. I stepped forward, crunching over the fallen wood, and shined my flashlight up toward the top of the tall window frame. My breath instantly caught in my throat. I stood completely frozen. There, perfectly preserved beneath decades of thick grime and protective wooden boards, was a breathtakingly intricate 19th-century stained glass transom window. The bright beam of my flashlight caught the vibrant colors, illuminating deep cobalt blues, rich ruby reds, and brilliant emerald greens. The glass projected a stunning kaleidoscope of fractured, colorful light across the dark, ruined room, painting the dusty floorboards in a warm, beautiful glow. The heavy lead came holding the individual pieces of glass together was thick, expertly crafted, and entirely undamaged. It was an original museum-quality architectural feature that would cost tens of thousands of dollars to replicate today. It had been sitting here hiding in the dark, waiting for someone to finally uncover it. I reached out with a trembling hand and gently traced the cold, smooth surface of the colored glass. I smiled in the dark, the warmth of the moment completely erasing the freezing temperature of the room. My family thought I had bought a worthless pile of garbage because they only ever possessed the ability to look at the superficial surface of things. But I knew exactly what I had bought, and the real work was just about to begin. I woke up the next morning to the harsh gray light of dawn, filtering through the cracked wooden boards of the front parlor. My back ached deeply from sleeping directly on the hard floorboards, and my breath plumed into white clouds in the freezing air of the abandoned house. For a brief, disorienting second before I fully opened my eyes, I thought I was still in my parents' heated basement. But the sharp, earthy smell of dust and old timber instantly brought me back to reality. I unzipped my thermal sleeping bag, shivering against the bitter cold, and reached into my heavy winter coat pocket for my phone. The screen was completely lit up with dozens of missed calls and an endless stream of text message notifications. My battery was already draining rapidly from the sheer volume of incoming alerts. I unlocked the screen and opened my social media apps, immediately discovering the source of the chaos. Jasmine had been incredibly busy while I was sleeping on the cold floor. She had posted a highly produced 5-minute video on her Instagram page. She was sitting on her expensive velvet living room sofa wearing oversized luxury silk pajamas and absolutely no makeup to perfectly execute the vulnerable victim aesthetic for her audience. She was staring directly into the camera lens with shiny, tear-filled eyes. She did not mention my name directly because that would violate her carefully curated brand guidelines, but the target of her monologue was completely obvious to anyone who knew us. She spoke softly about the deep, profound pain of encountering toxic energy within your own inner circle. She wiped away a single, perfectly timed tear and talked about how devastating it is when selfish family members actively choose to hold you back from your spiritual and financial destiny. She claimed her aura was completely shattered because someone she trusted deeply had deliberately sabotaged her healing journey just to be cruel and spiteful. She told her followers that she was being forced to cancel her restorative trip to Tulum because of a massive, unexpected familial betrayal. The comments section beneath the video was already flooded with hundreds of her loyal followers, offering their unconditional support and praising her for being so incredibly brave in the face of such dark negativity. But the public performance on the internet was only half of the attack. The real venom was waiting for me in my text messages. My mother Brenda had clearly spent her entire morning calling every single aunt, uncle, and cousin in our extended family to spin her twisted version of what happened last night at the dinner table. They were the flying monkeys doing Brenda and her dirty work so she could keep her own hands completely clean while coordinating the assault. My phone vibrated violently in my hand as a massive paragraph came through from my Aunt Patricia. She told me I was a complete disgrace to the family name and that I had selfishly abandoned my parents after everything they had sacrificed to raise me. She called me a traitor for leaving them high and dry just because they asked for a little bit of help for my struggling sister. Then came the aggressive texts from my cousin Jamal. He rapidly typed that I was acting like a bitter, jealous hater because Jasmine was successful and beautiful, while I was just an unmarried woman hiding in a basement playing with old blueprints. He told me I needed to immediately grow up, apologize to my mother, and pay my sister what I owed her. Message after message poured in from people who only saw me at Thanksgiving and Christmas. They called me heartless, arrogant, and out of control. They all blindly believed the carefully constructed narrative that I was a cruel, ungrateful daughter who had stormed out of a family dinner in a fit of rage, holding my money hostage to punish my sister. None of them bothered to ask for my side of the story. None of them knew about the $2,000 in rent I faithfully paid every single month to keep my parents from defaulting on their mortgage. None of them knew that Jasmine and Trent were secretly drowning in massive credit card debt while parading around the city in designer clothes. And none of them knew that I was currently sitting in a freezing abandoned house that I had purchased with my own hard-earned savings because my mother had threatened to throw me onto the street. In the past, I would have immediately drafted a massive group text trying desperately to defend my character. I would have sent screenshots of my bank statements and tried to logically explain my side of the story to people who were completely committed to misunderstanding me. I would have exhausted myself trying to prove my basic worth to a jury that had already convicted me before I even walked into the courtroom. I had spent 35 years begging these people to see my perspective and treat me with basic human respect. But sitting there in the cold morning light staring at the magnificent 19th century stained glass window I had uncovered the night before, something inside my chest felt incredibly light and completely detached. I realized that arguing with them was a complete waste of my precious energy. They needed me to be the terrible villain so that Jasmine could remain the flawless golden child, and Brenda could remain the perfect martyred mother. If I fought back, I was only giving them exactly what they wanted, which was more dramatic ammunition to feed their toxic echo chamber. I refused to participate in their exhausting circus for another second. I closed out of the messages without reading the rest of them. I went into my phone settings and completely disabled notifications for every single family member. I muted the massive family group chats and turned on the Do Not Disturb feature, locking the device and tossing it onto my sleeping bag. The violent buzzing finally stopped. The profound, heavy silence of the old Victorian house washed over me, replacing the chaotic digital noise of my family with the quiet, demanding promise of hard physical work. I stood up, stretching my aching muscles, and took a deep breath of the cold, dusty air. I took a thick rubber band from my wrist and tied my hair up into a tight high bun completely out of my face. I pulled on my heavy canvas work pants, laced up my reinforced steel-toed boots, and pulled on my thick protective leather work gloves. I walked over to my heavy canvas tool bag sitting in the center of the parlor floor. I bypassed the small pry bars, the delicate paint scrapers, and the measuring tapes. I reached down and picked up my massive 10-pound steel sledgehammer. The heavy weight of the solid iron head felt perfectly balanced and incredibly powerful in my hands. Let them talk. Let Jasmine cry fake tears to her gullible followers on the internet, and let my mother play the tragic victim to the aunts and cousins. Let them waste their days obsessing over my sudden absence while they slowly drown in their own financial lies. I had absolutely no time to entertain their delusions or seek their validation ever again. I gripped the thick handle of the sledgehammer tightly and turned toward a massive wall of cheap, rotting drywall that was hiding the original structural brick. I swung the heavy steel hammer with absolutely everything I had, shattering the brittle surface into 1,000 pieces. I was done being their stepping stone. I had an empire to build. The days turned into weeks, and my entire existence shrank down to the four walls of that Victorian shell. I developed a strict, relentless daily routine. I woke up with the sun crawling out of my thermal sleeping bag into the freezing morning air. I boiled water on a small propane camp stove to wash my face and make instant coffee before strapping on my heavy tool belt. I worked until my muscles were trembling with exhaustion, and the moon was high in the sky. I brought in a loud, portable generator to power my heavy-duty floodlights and my specialized power tools. I did not just swing a hammer blindly like some amateur house flipper looking for a quick profit. I treated this property with the absolute reverence of an archaeologist excavating a sacred temple. Every single layer of decay I removed was a calculated, deliberate step toward breathing life back into a masterpiece that had been written off as worthless. My hands became thickly calloused and permanently stained with old plaster dust, but my mind was sharper and more focused than it had ever been. I completely ignored the bitter cold that seeped through the uninsulated walls. I channeled all of the lingering anger and deep betrayal from my family directly into sheer physical stamina. Every time my shoulders burned and my muscles screamed for a break, I pictured Trent grinning in his designer vest, mocking my career. Every time I wanted to give up and sleep in, I heard my mother telling me to go live like junk. The physical labor was intensely grueling, but it was also profoundly healing. I was not tearing this old house down. I was setting it free. My first major restoration project was the massive front parlor. Someone in the late 1980s had come through the property and hastily slapped up cheap thin drywall right over the original walls, completely erasing the historic character of the room to modernize it on a terrible budget. I took a sharp utility knife and carefully scored the seams, peeling back the brittle white sheets piece by piece. I wore a heavy respirator mask to protect my lungs from the decades of trapped dust filling the air. As the cheap modern drywall crumbled away and crashed to the floor, the true soul of the house finally emerged from the dark. Hidden beneath the flimsy modern garbage was spectacular, original hand-carved mahogany wainscoting. The dark, rich wood was perfectly preserved, stretching across the entire length of the massive room. The craftsmanship was absolutely breathtaking, featuring intricate floral motifs and geometric patterns that were painstakingly carved by hand over a century ago. It was a level of detail and artistic dedication that modern residential builders simply do not replicate anymore. I ran my gloved hands over the smooth, raised wood, feeling a deep sense of connection to the original craftsman who had built this place. But the beautiful mahogany was not the only secret the front parlor was keeping from me. I moved to the center of the main wall and began chiseling away at a thick layer of cracked water-stained plaster that bulged strangely into the living space. It took 3 hours of tedious, careful tapping with my heavy masonry chisel, but eventually the thick plaster gave way and fell to the floor in heavy, dusty chunks. Beneath it was a massive, structurally flawless exposed brick fireplace. The deep red bricks were arranged in a stunning herringbone pattern, completely untouched by the water damage that had ruined the surrounding area. The heavy iron flue was still perfectly intact. I stood back, wiping the sweat and dirt from my forehead, and stared at the magnificent room slowly coming back to life. My family had confidently called this place a crack den. They were so blinded by their own superficial greed and obsession with shiny new things that they could not see the priceless historic treasure sitting right in front of them. By the end of my third week of non-stop labor, I turned my attention to the heavily damaged floorboards near the front bay window. The roof had clearly leaked decades ago, leaving a large section of the original thick oak flooring warped, uneven, and dangerously soft to walk on. It all needed to be carefully pulled up so I could inspect the structural joists underneath for any dangerous rot. I knelt down on the dusty floor, positioning my heavy steel pry bar under the edge of the worst plank. I pushed down hard, expecting the rotted wood to easily snap and give way under my weight. Instead, the sharp metal tip of my pry bar hit something completely unyielding beneath the floorboards. It made a loud, sharp clinking sound that instantly echoed through the empty, cavernous room. I paused, my brow furrowing in confusion. It was not the dull, heavy thud of striking a wooden support joist. It was definitely not the hollow, scraping sound of hitting a forgotten cast-iron plumbing pipe. It was the distinct, unmistakable metallic ring of striking solid, heavy iron. I adjusted my grip on the pry bar and dug it deeper into the tight crevice between the warped planks. I threw my entire body weight onto the thick steel handle, forcing the stubborn floorboard up until it cracked loudly and split straight down the middle. I dropped the tool, reached in with my heavy leather gloves, and ripped the jagged pieces of sharp wood away, tossing them aside into a pile. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight from my tool belt and shined the bright beam directly into the dark, narrow cavity beneath the floor. Nestled deep inside the hollow space, resting on a thick bed of century-old dust and undisturbed cobwebs, was a large, rusted, heavy metal lockbox. It was covered in a thick layer of dark grime, but the intricate brass keyhole on the front was still clearly visible, catching the light of my flashlight. It had absolutely not been dropped down there by accident. It had been purposefully and carefully hidden beneath the floorboards, specifically designed to remain completely undiscovered by anyone walking above it. I reached down into the dark, cold cavity, my heart pounding heavily against my ribs, and wrapped my fingers firmly around the cold iron handle. I gripped the cold iron handle of the lockbox and pulled upward with all of my strength. The box was surprisingly heavy, fighting against my grip as it scraped against the jagged edges of the broken floorboards. I hoisted it out of the dark cavity and set it down heavily onto the dusty parlor floor. A thick cloud of century-old dust puffed into the freezing air, catching the bright beam of my flashlight. I knelt beside the box, examining the rusted surface. It was a solid cast-iron strongbox, the kind wealthy families used to transport valuables on stagecoaches or trains. The front was secured by a heavy brass padlock that had completely seized up with decades of dark green corrosion. I did not have the key, and I did not have the patience to try and pick a rusted antique lock. I stood up and walked over to my tool bag, grabbing my heavy masonry chisel and the 10-pound steel sledgehammer. I knelt back down on the floorboards, positioning the sharp tungsten tip of the chisel directly against the shackle of the brass padlock. I took a deep breath, raised the heavy sledgehammer, and brought it down with a forceful, calculated strike. The impact rang out like a gunshot in the empty house. The rusted brass shattered instantly, sending small fragments of metal flying across the room. The broken padlock dropped heavily to the floor. My heart was hammering against my ribs as I reached out and lifted the heavy iron lid. The rusted hinges let out a loud, piercing squeal that echoed into the dark hallway. I shined my flashlight directly inside, fully expecting to find antique coins or forgotten family silver. Instead, I found something infinitely more valuable to an architectural historian. Resting at the bottom of the box was a large, thick bundle carefully wrapped in dark, heavy, waterproof oilcloth. The cloth was secured tightly with a stiff, dried leather cord. I set my flashlight down on the floor, angling the beam so it illuminated the box. I reached inside and gently lifted the bundle out. It felt incredibly delicate, but the waterproof oilcloth had done its job perfectly, protecting whatever was inside from the water damage that had rotted the floorboards above it. I carefully untied the brittle leather cord and slowly folded back the stiff layers of dark cloth. The distinct rich smell of aged parchment and cedarwood immediately drifted into the cold air. Inside the protective wrapping lay several large folded sheets of thick drafting paper and a heavy legal document. I carefully lifted the first sheet of drafting paper and gently unfolded it, spreading it out flat across the dusty floorboards. I leaned in close, bringing the flashlight directly over the paper. My breath caught in my throat. They were the original hand-drawn architectural blueprints for the entire house. The level of detail was absolutely staggering. The plans were drawn with meticulous precision, showing the exact layout of the majestic Victorian structure. It detailed the intricate hand-carved mahogany wainscoting. I had just uncovered the exact dimensions of the stained glass transom window and the complex structural framework of the entire building. The blueprints revealed that the house was far larger than it appeared from the outside, featuring a hidden library, a massive formal dining hall, and a sprawling wraparound porch that had been completely swallowed by overgrown ivy. It was a residential masterpiece. But the blueprints were only the beginning. I gently moved the large sheets aside and picked up the heavy legal document resting beneath them. It was folded neatly into thirds made of thick, durable cotton paper. The elegant flowing calligraphy across the top of the page identified it as a formal property deed. I scanned down the page, reading the beautifully scripted black ink, until my eyes landed on the official date of execution, October 4th, 1890. Then I looked at the name of the original property owner listed on the deed. I read the name out loud, my voice barely a whisper in the empty room. Jeremiah Sterling. I fell back, sitting hard on the dusty floorboards, completely stunned. I knew exactly who Jeremiah Sterling was. I had studied him extensively during my university history courses. He was a legendary African-American abolitionist who became a wildly successful industrialist and merchant in the decades following the Civil War. He was a titan of early Black wealth and extreme philanthropy. He did not just use his massive fortune to build a comfortable life for himself. He used his wealth to actively uplift the entire community, funding private schools for Black children and providing crucial legal defense for falsely accused men in the city. These documents proved that this exact house was his personal residence. This was not just a beautiful old building. This house was a historic fortress. It had served as a central hub for the African American community, a safe haven for intellectual discourse, and a meeting ground for the most prominent civil rights leaders of the era. The massive parlor I was currently sitting in had likely hosted incredible minds and witnessed vital strategies for community survival. The historical weight of what I was holding in my bare hands was overwhelming. This house had survived the racist redlining policies of the 1930s. It had survived the deliberate economic starvation of the entire neighborhood, and it had survived decades of complete, total abandonment. It had stood strong in the dark, patiently waiting for someone to come along and pull the boards off the windows. I sat there in the freezing cold, completely surrounded by dirt and debris, thinking about my family. I thought about Trent standing in his designer clothes, laughing in my face and calling this place a worthless crack den. I thought about Jasmine crying over a fake spiritual retreat to Tulum while stepping over the struggles of her own ancestors. I thought about my mother telling me to go live like junk because I refused to fund their shallow, superficial lifestyles. They were so utterly consumed by the pursuit of fake digital wealth and empty social status that they possessed absolutely no respect for the powerful shoulders they stood on. They had looked at a priceless, irreplaceable monument of Black history and saw only garbage because it lacked a shiny, fresh coat of paint. They threw me away, and in doing so, they threw me directly into my ultimate purpose. I carefully folded the heavy property deed and placed it back into the waterproof oilcloth, along with the magnificent original blueprints. I wrapped the bundle tightly and secured it with the leather cord. I knew exactly what I held in my hands, and I knew exactly what I had to do next. This was no longer just a personal renovation project to secure my financial independence. This was a profound preservation mission. But I also knew the dangerous reality of city politics and predatory real estate developers. If the wrong people found out about the true history of this property before I had legally secured its protected status, they would absolutely try to steal it right out from under me. I needed bulletproof documentation, and I needed a trusted ally to help me navigate the city archives in complete and total silence. The very next morning, I carefully placed the wrapped oilcloth bundle into my secure leather portfolio and locked the heavy front door of the house behind me. I drove straight to the downtown municipal building to find the one person in this city I could actually trust with a discovery of this magnitude. His name is Malik. Malik is 36 years old and works as a senior archivist for the City Historical Records Department. We had met several years ago during a complex downtown restoration project, and he had quickly become my closest ally in the architectural world. Unlike my family, Malik understood the profound value of preserving the past. He was brilliant, meticulous, and most importantly, he knew how to keep his mouth shut. I walked through the quiet marble halls of the basement archives and found him sitting behind his massive oak desk, completely surrounded by towering stacks of century-old property ledgers. He looked up, adjusting his glasses as I approached. I did not waste any time with small talk. I placed my leather portfolio flat on his desk, unzipped it, and carefully slid the wrapped bundle across the smooth wood. I told him I needed his professional eyes on something, but that the conversation could never leave this room under any circumstances. Malik saw the absolute seriousness in my expression. He pushed his paperwork aside, untied the leather cord, and folded back the stiff oilcloth. When he saw the flawless calligraphy of the 1890 deed and the intricate hand-drawn blueprints, his jaw literally dropped. He stood up from his chair, leaning closely over the fragile documents. He traced his finger over the name Jeremiah Sterling and looked up at me, completely speechless. He asked me exactly where I had found this, and I told him I bought the man and his actual house at the county tax auction for exactly $800. Malik let out a low whistle of pure disbelief. He immediately walked over to the heavy wooden door of his office, locked it from the inside, and pulled the blinds down over the glass partition. He knew exactly what was at stake. We spent the next 3 hours hunched over his desk, carefully cross-referencing the original property lines on the antique deed with the modern digital zoning maps of the city. We had to make absolutely sure that the boundaries listed in 1890 perfectly matched the exact parcel of land I had legally purchased. We pored over surveyor notes and historical grid adjustments, tracking the property through decades of neglect and forgotten records. As Malik typed the final coordinates into the secure city planning database, his eyes suddenly widened. He stopped typing and leaned back heavily in his chair, staring blankly at the glowing computer monitor. He told me to come around the desk and look at the screen. What he pulled up was a highly classified preliminary zoning map that had not yet been released to the general public or the local press. The entire neighborhood surrounding my property was highlighted in a bright, glowing neon green border. Malik pointed to the screen, his voice thick with absolute shock. He explained that the city council had just secretly approved a massive multi-million-dollar commercial and residential revitalization initiative. It was officially designated as the new Heritage District. The city was preparing to pour massive amounts of federal funding into upgrading the local infrastructure, repairing the roads, and heavily incentivizing high-end luxury development in that exact area. My $800 abandoned Victorian house was not just sitting inside the borders of this new project. According to the digital map, my property was sitting dead center, in the exact middle of the designated zone. Because of its massive lot size and prominent corner location, it was positioned perfectly to become the central historical anchor of the entire neighborhood. Malik quickly pulled up the estimated commercial property valuations for the new district, and the numbers flashing on the screen were absolutely staggering. The land alone was about to skyrocket in value exponentially overnight, the moment the city made the project public. My mind immediately raced back to my family. My mother calling me a complete failure. Trent laughing until he cried, calling my house a crack den in the slums. Jasmine crying over her fake spiritual retreat, acting like I had ruined her life by choosing my own future over her vacation. They had all treated me like I was making the biggest financial mistake of my life, because they lacked the vision to see beyond the surface. But standing there, in the quiet archives, looking at the glowing map, I realized I had accidentally stumbled into the real estate deal of a lifetime. I had secured a literal goldmine for the price of a cheap used car. But the initial wave of overwhelming triumph was quickly replaced by a sharp, chilling realization. Malik turned away from the computer screen and looked at me with absolute dead serious intensity. He warned me that predatory commercial developers and massive corporate investment firms already had paid insiders working at City Hall. Those ruthless firms were likely already quietly buying up the surrounding abandoned lots through anonymous shell companies, paying pennies on the dollar, before the news officially broke to the public. The moment those aggressive developers realized that a single independent black woman owned the historic anchor property of their new multi-million-dollar district, they would come for me with absolutely everything they had. They would use every legal loophole, every corrupt zoning code, and every dirty trick in the book to force me out and steal the land right from under my feet. Malik looked me right in the eyes, his voice dropping to an urgent, serious whisper. "Simone," he said, "if you get this house legally recognized on the Federal Historic Registry, this property is instantly worth millions of dollars, and it will be federally protected from any corporate seizure. You will be completely untouchable. But you have to move incredibly fast, and you have to do it in absolute total secrecy before the developers find out what you are sitting on." I left Malik in the city archives with a fire burning inside my chest that completely eradicated the bitter winter cold. I knew the aggressive timeline I was up against. Corporate developers with deep pockets and corrupt politicians on their payroll moved incredibly fast, but they were also incredibly arrogant. They relied heavily on the assumption that the poor residents of historically redlined neighborhoods would not understand the complex legal maneuvers required to protect their own land. But I was not an uninformed resident. I was a professional architectural consultant, and I knew exactly how to weaponize the municipal bureaucratic system to my absolute advantage. I drove straight back to the abandoned Victorian house, dragging my heavy boots up the sagging porch and locking the massive oak door securely behind me. I did not reach for my sledgehammer or my crowbar today. Instead, I unzipped my thick winter coat, sat down cross-legged on my thermal sleeping bag, and opened my laptop. I set up a secure mobile hotspot on my phone and prepared to wage a silent administrative war. For the next 72 hours, I barely slept. I carefully photographed and digitally scanned every single inch of the original 1890 property deed and the fragile hand-drawn blueprints, making sure the signature of Jeremiah Sterling was perfectly legible. I spent hours drafting a meticulous, comprehensive historical narrative detailing the life and the profound local impact of the legendary abolitionist. I documented exactly how this specific structure served as a vital safe haven for the African American community during a time of intense racial hostility and systemic oppression. I compiled all of these historical documents, structural assessments, and architectural proofs into a massive bulletproof dossier. I submitted the entire package directly to the Federal Register of Historic Places through a secure encrypted government portal. By filing at the federal level rather than the state level, I was actively bypassing the corrupt local city council members who were likely already taking massive bribes from the commercial developers. Once the federal government officially recognized the property as a protected historic landmark, no local developer or city zoning board could ever legally demolish it or seize the land under the guise of eminent domain. But securing the protected historic status was only the first half of my silent offensive. To truly solidify my absolute control over the property and fund the massive restoration ahead, I needed serious capital. I accessed the city municipal database and located a highly specific, highly underutilized development grant. It was a massive fund specifically designated for minority-owned historic preservation projects within the city limits. Because the application process was notoriously complex and required a deep technical understanding of architectural preservation standards, the funds often sat completely untouched for years at a time. I poured every ounce of my professional expertise into that application. I drafted detailed line item budgets, comprehensive structural integrity reports, and projected timeline milestones for the entire renovation. I outlined the exact costs for updating the century-old electrical grid, replacing the damaged slate roof, and restoring the hand-carved mahogany wainscoting. I did not ask for a modest sum just to make the house livable. I requested the absolute maximum amount legally allowed by the municipal fund, $450,000. I attached my architectural credentials, my portfolio of past historic renovations, and the newly submitted federal registry application. I clicked submit and watched the progress bar load across my screen, feeling a massive wave of power wash over me. The trap was officially set. All I had to do now was wait in total silence. While I was meticulously laying the legal groundwork to build my multi-million-dollar empire, my family was entirely consumed with celebrating what they truly believed was my rock-bottom failure. I had muted their text messages to protect my peace, but I still needed to check my phone constantly for email updates from the Federal Registry and the City Grant Office. Every single time I unlocked my screen, the notifications from our family group chat were waiting for me like a digital plague. Jasmine and Trent were leading a relentless, cruel campaign of mockery. Trent had taken it upon himself to send daily text messages filled with completely unhinged insults. He sent me direct links to local homeless shelters and downtown soup kitchens tagging my phone number so the notification would pop up directly on my screen. He typed long, condescending paragraphs asking if I had contracted tetanus yet, or if the local stray dogs had officially claimed the front parlor as their own territory. He asked if I was using a plastic bucket for a toilet and told me to let him know if I needed a warm cup of coffee because he was feeling generous after supposedly closing a massive crypto deal. Jasmine was right there beside him, playing the role of the deeply concerned but morally superior sister. She sent passive-aggressive prayers to the group chat, asking the universe to soften my stubborn pride before I froze to death in the slums. She posted pictures of the expensive room service she was ordering at a local luxury hotel, complaining about how hard her life was since her Tulum trip was ruined. She subtly reminded the entire extended family that I was the direct cause of her deep spiritual pain and financial stress. My mother Brenda chimed in regularly, validating their cruelty. She typed that this was exactly the kind of harsh reality check I needed to finally understand my rightful place in the family hierarchy. She told my aunts and cousins that she was practicing tough love by refusing to check on me, hoping the miserable freezing cold would force me to come crawling back to her basement, begging for forgiveness and completely ready to fund Jasmine and her lifestyle without any further questions. My father Calvin remained completely silent in the chat, never once typing a single word to defend me or check on my safety. In the past, their words would have crushed my spirit entirely. I would have spent hours crying in the dark, wondering why the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally took such immense pleasure in kicking me when they thought I was down. But sitting in the dusty parlor with the undeniable proof of my million-dollar assets safely submitted to the federal government, their messages did not hurt me at all. In fact, I welcomed them. I did not block their phone numbers, and I did not leave the family group chat. I used their profound arrogance as my greatest psychological shield. Their absolute certainty that I was failing miserably was the perfect distraction. It guaranteed that they would never bother to drive down to the red-lined neighborhood to see what I was actually doing. It guaranteed that Trent, who fancied himself a genius real estate investor, would never look closely at the city zoning maps or check the recent property transfer records. As long as they were busy laughing at the imaginary, miserable version of me they had created in their heads, they were completely blind to the very real empire I was building right beneath their feet. I sat on the floorboards and read Trent sending another mocking link to a discount hardware store. I smiled, taking a sip of my cheap instant coffee. I let them believe they had won. I let them type their cruel jokes and celebrate their fake superiority. because I knew that the louder they laughed right now, the more devastating their silence would be when the trap finally snapped shut. I was 3 weeks into the grueling exterior structural repairs when my uninvited guest finally arrived. I had just finished erecting the heavy steel scaffolding around the front porch to stabilize the sagging roofline. The loud, aggressive rumble of a sports car engine suddenly cut through the quiet neighborhood. I wiped the sweat and plaster dust from my forehead and looked down from the second tier of the scaffolding. A sleek silver sports car that I immediately recognized parked illegally right next to the cracked curb. The driver's side door popped open, and Trent stepped out into the muddy street. He was dressed as if he were attending a luxury yacht party rather than visiting an active construction site in a historically red-lined district. He wore a tailored pastel vest over a crisp white designer shirt and a pair of spotless $900 Italian leather loafers. Before he even closed his car door, he had his smartphone out, holding it high in the air to record the overgrown yard and the imposing rusted scaffolding. He was live streaming. I could hear his loud, obnoxious voice carrying over the quiet street as he narrated his arrival for Jasmine and her thousands of loyal followers. He pointed his camera directly at the boarded-up windows and the peeling exterior paint, shaking his head in exaggerated theatrical pity. He walked up the muddy front path, carefully trying to avoid the dirty puddles, while loudly explaining to his virtual audience that he was just a deeply concerned brother-in-law checking in on his troubled family member. I climbed down the metal scaffolding ladders, keeping my expression completely neutral. I met him at the front doorway, holding a dripping, heavy-duty paint scraper in my gloved hand. He lowered his phone just a fraction, flashing me a brilliant fake smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Look at you," he chuckled, gesturing vaguely at my dirt-covered canvas work clothes, playing the brave little construction worker. "Jasmine was so incredibly worried about you freezing to death out here, but it looks like you are getting plenty of exercise swinging a hammer in the absolute slums." I did not invite him inside, but he pushed past me anyway, stepping confidently over the heavy oak threshold and into the massive front parlor. The heavy scent of his expensive designer cologne instantly clashed with the smell of centuries-old dust and exposed brick. He immediately brought his phone back up, panning across the shattered drywall, the torn floorboards, and the massive piles of debris I had painstakingly cleared. He let out a long, dramatic whistle of pure mockery, ensuring his microphone caught every single sound. "Simone, this is an absolute disaster," he announced loudly, turning the camera to capture my reaction. "You are completely in over your head. You look at old floor plans for a living. You are not a general contractor. This place is a bottomless money pit." I stood quietly by the doorway, intentionally shrinking my posture and keeping my eyes cast downward. I played the exact role he desperately needed me to play. I let my shoulders slump and I nodded slowly, acting completely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the renovation project. I needed him to deeply believe that I was drowning in regret and financial ruin. "You know the real estate market is brutal right now." Trent continued, aggressively pacing across the room as if he owned the property. "My crypto portfolio is generating massive passive income, while you are out here burning your entire life savings on rotted wood and rat droppings. You will be completely bankrupt in a month, Simone. When the city inspectors inevitably come and condemn this garbage heap, you will be crawling right back to Brenda and her basement begging for your old room. But do not worry about it too much. I will personally make sure Jasmine forgives you when you finally apologize and pay her what you owe her." He was so entirely consumed by his own arrogant monologue and the flattering reflection of his face on his phone screen that he was not paying any attention to where he was actually walking. Earlier that morning, I had begun the painstaking process of restoring a damaged section of the original oak floorboards near the center of the room. I had poured a thick, heavy puddle of industrial-grade chemical wood stripper directly onto the century-old varnish. The chemical was highly corrosive, specifically designed to eat through thick layers of hardened resin, tough lacquer, and industrial glue in a matter of minutes. It was incredibly slick and gave off a sharp, acidic odor. But Trent was completely oblivious, breathing in the dust and his own massive ego. I took a deliberate step to my left, subtly blocking his path toward the restored brick fireplace, forcing him to pivot toward the center of the room. He took the bait perfectly. He took 3 confident, arrogant strides forward, still holding his phone up high to film the ceiling joints. His right foot planted directly into the center of the thick puddle of acidic wood stripper. His $900 designer leather loafer immediately slid out from under him. He flailed his arms wildly, dropping his expensive phone onto the dusty floorboards to catch his balance before he completely wiped out. He managed to stay upright, but both of his Italian leather shoes were now planted firmly in the highly corrosive chemical pool. The reaction was absolutely instantaneous. The powerful industrial acid immediately began eating directly into the soft, expensive leather of his loafers. A loud sizzling sound echoed in the quiet room, accompanied by the sharp, putrid smell of melting synthetic rubber and burning dye. Trent looked down in absolute horror as the pristine beige leather rapidly bubbled, blistered, and turned a sickly, charred black right before his eyes. He frantically lifted his feet, stumbling backward onto the dry floorboards, but the devastating damage was already permanently done. His shoes were completely destroyed, the soles melting aggressively onto the old oak wood. His face contorted from smug superiority to pure, unhinged rage. He screamed a string of violent curses at me, completely dropping his fake, concerned persona for his internet followers. He snatched his cracked phone off the floor and stormed out the front door, limping awkwardly in his ruined, melting shoes. He cursed my name all the way down the muddy path, leaving a trail of acidic black footprints behind him. I stood in the doorway, leaning casually against the doorframe, and smiled as he peeled away from the curb in his sports car. The trap was working perfectly. I watched the silver sports car speed down the cracked asphalt, disappearing around the corner. The loud roar of the engine faded, leaving the neighborhood completely quiet once again, except for the gentle rustling of the overgrown oak trees. I looked down at the dark, acidic footprints Trent had left on the porch boards. I grabbed an old rag and a bucket of water to neutralize the chemical spill, making sure he had not permanently damaged the exterior wood. As I was wiping down the boards, my phone vibrated aggressively in my thick canvas work pocket. I sighed heavily, wiping the sweat and dirt from my brow with the back of my wrist. I fully expected it to be a massive barrage of angry text messages. Trent was undoubtedly calling Jasmine right that second, screaming about his ruined Italian leather loafers and demanding that I reimburse him. I pulled the phone out, preparing to swipe away the notifications from the toxic family group chat. But the screen did not show a message from my mother or my sister. It was an urgent email notification from the City Department of Historic Preservation. My heart skipped a beat. I stripped off my heavy leather work gloves, dropping them onto the porch, and unlocked the screen with trembling fingers. I opened the email. It was directly from the senior city inspector I had been silently corresponding with for the past few weeks. The subject line read, "Official Status Update for Minority Historic Preservation Grant Application." I leaned against the heavy wooden door frame, holding my breath as I read through the dense, formal, bureaucratic language. "Dear Ms. Simone," the email began, "we have thoroughly reviewed your extensive federal and municipal applications regarding the Jeremiah Sterling property. The Preservation Committee was absolutely astounded by the historical depth of your dossier and your pristine architectural restoration blueprints. It is my immense pleasure to inform you that your application has been unanimously approved by the board." I scrolled down to the second paragraph, my eyes scanning the screen as fast as I could. The city did not just approve a partial grant to patch the roof. Because of the extreme historical significance of the abolitionist ties and the impending Heritage District revitalization, they had approved the absolute maximum funding available. I had officially been awarded $450,000 in direct restoration funds. The money was completely tax-free and slated to be wired directly into my newly established business account within 48 hours. But the email did not stop there. The city inspector had also attached an official municipal pre-appraisal document. Because the property was now formally recognized by the Federal Registry and backed by city development funds, the valuation had completely transformed. The document clearly stated that upon the precise completion of my approved restoration blueprints, the house was officially pre-appraised at $1.2 million. $1.2 million. I read the number out loud, my voice cracking in the cold air. A few weeks ago, I was sitting at a mahogany dining table being treated like an absolute peasant by people who valued a $15,000 vacation over my entire future. They had kicked me out into the freezing rain and told me to go live like junk. They had laughed at my $800 investment. Trent had just stood in my living room completely mocking my financial literacy while actively destroying his own shoes. And now, while they were drowning in secret credit card debt and obsessing over their fake internet lives, I was holding a legally binding document confirming that I was a millionaire in the making. I stepped backward inside the house and pushed the massive solid oak front door shut. I engaged the heavy deadbolt, locking myself safely inside my historic fortress. I looked around the dusty parlor, at the exposed brick, at the magnificent mahogany wainscoting, and at the beautiful 19th-century stained glass window illuminating the room. The oppressive weight of my family and their decades of manipulation and financial abuse completely lifted off my shoulders. I threw my head back and I laughed. It was not a small chuckle. It was a deep, loud, echoing laugh that bounced off the high plaster ceilings and filled the entire empty house. I laughed until tears streamed down my dust-covered face. I laughed at Trent and his melted loafers. I laughed at Jasmine and her blocked chakras. I laughed at my mother and her pathetic need to control me through money. They had tried to bury me under $800 of dirt, completely failing to realize that I was the solid foundation this entire family had been standing on. The $450,000 meant I no longer had to sleep in a freezing thermal bag and do every single piece of grueling labor entirely by myself. I could finally hire a top-tier professional crew. I could bring in master electricians to safely rewire the entire century-old grid. I could hire specialized historic plumbers to install modern heating and custom copper piping. I could afford the expensive custom-milled slate tiles required to perfectly restore the sagging roof to its original 1890 glory. This was the exact turning point. The silent, grueling phase of my plan was officially over. With a massive influx of capital arriving in my bank account in 2 days, I was about to shift this restoration into absolute overdrive. I wiped the tears of joy from my face and looked down at my phone one last time. A new notification popped up at the top of the screen. It was a text from the family group chat. Trent had sent a furious message calling me a chaotic psychopath. Jasmine replied with a crying emoji complaining that her husband was deeply traumatized by my aggressive living conditions. I simply smiled, muted the screen again, and walked over to my blueprints, spreading them out across the floorboards. I grabbed my red marker and began circling the major structural projects. My family was entirely focused on a pair of ruined shoes while I was preparing to resurrect a neighborhood. It was time to start hiring my professional crew. The next 6 months passed in an absolute blur of sawdust, freshly poured concrete, and the relentless humming of heavy machinery. I was no longer sleeping on a dusty floorboard in a freezing thermal bag. I was no longer swinging a 10-pound sledgehammer entirely by myself in the dark. The massive influx of capital from the city grant allowed me to hire the absolute best minority-owned contracting firms in the entire state. I brought in master carpenters who meticulously replicated the missing sections of the hand-carved mahogany wainscoting. I hired specialized electricians who completely ripped out the dangerous century-old wiring and installed a flawless modern grid. Expert plumbers ran state-of-the-art copper piping through the thick walls and installed a highly efficient modern heating system. The house rapidly transformed from a decaying abandoned shell into a living, breathing architectural masterpiece. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in early autumn when the final phase of the exterior restoration was officially completed. I stood across the newly paved street and watched in absolute awe as the heavy steel scaffolding was finally dismantled and hauled away by the massive work trucks. The heavy, thick plywood that had blinded this house for decades was completely gone. The exterior facade was flawlessly painted in a historically accurate palette of deep navy blue with crisp, bright white trim and rich gold architectural accents. The once sagging front porch was now perfectly level, supported by strong, custom-milled columns and smooth, sturdy floorboards. The damaged roof had been entirely replaced with pristine dark slate tiles that gleamed under the morning sun. But the absolute crown jewel of the entire exterior was the front bay window. The spectacular 19th century stained glass transom window was finally free to catch the natural sunlight. It threw vibrant, dazzling shades of ruby red and deep emerald green across the solid oak front door. The neighborhood residents who had walked past this forgotten corner for years actually stopped on the sidewalk to stare. It was no longer a dilapidated eyesore or a dangerous trap house. It was a majestic Victorian gem, standing proudly as a beacon of historical survival. A transformation of this incredible magnitude in the center of a historically redlined district did not stay a local secret for very long. Word of the project spread rapidly through the city zoning offices, the local historical societies, and the professional contracting networks. The buzz eventually reached the editor-in-chief of a highly prestigious national architectural design magazine. They contacted me directly asking to do an exclusive cover feature on the property. I agreed to the interview and the photo shoot, but I made my terms completely non-negotiable. I told them the story was not just about the incredible antique woodwork or the expensive slate roof. It was about Jeremiah Sterling. It was about preserving vital Black history in a neighborhood that the local government had deliberately tried to erase. The magazine sent a top-tier professional crew with high-end cameras and expensive lighting equipment. They spent 2 entire days documenting every single square inch of the restored interior. They photographed the stunning herringbone brick fireplaces, the gleaming restored oak floors, and the massive hidden library I had completely resurrected from the dust. They interviewed me for hours about the grueling initial weeks of the project, the complex process of securing the federal registry status, and the absolute necessity of fighting to protect the physical legacy of an abolitionist hero. I spoke eloquently and passionately about my deep love for architectural history, completely omitting any mention of my toxic family. They did not deserve to be a part of this narrative. When the magazine finally hit the newsstands and was published simultaneously on their digital platform, the public reaction was absolutely explosive. The article was titled, "The Abolitionist Manor, a Solo Restoration Masterpiece." It did not just get a few thousand casual views, it went incredibly viral. Major national news outlets picked up the story and ran segments on their broadcast networks. Influential interior designers, prominent historians, and massive real estate accounts shared the stunning before and after photos across every single social media platform. My newly formed historic preservation firm was instantly legitimate. My professional inbox was completely flooded with hundreds of emails from wealthy clients and city developers begging me to consult on their own historic properties. Unlike Jasmine, who spent her entire life desperately chasing fake internet clout and begging strangers to validate her carefully curated aesthetic, my recognition was entirely grounded in massive, tangible reality. I did not have to fake a single tear or invent a spiritual crisis to get people to pay attention. The incredible physical proof of my hard work spoke entirely for itself. I drove down to an upscale local bookstore and bought a physical glossy copy of the magazine. I sat in the plush driver's seat of my newly purchased luxury SUV, running my hand over the smooth cover. There was a stunning full-page high-resolution photograph of me. I was standing proudly on the restored wraparound porch, wearing a sharp-tailored power suit, leaning casually against the historic brick facade. I looked strong, successful, and completely at peace. I looked like a woman who had built her own massive table instead of begging for scraps at someone else's. But it was not the beautiful professional photograph that made my heart race, and my hands tremble slightly. It was the bold black text printed directly beneath my name. The magazine journalists had fully investigated the new Heritage District revitalization project, and they had consulted with top-tier commercial real estate appraisers to evaluate my specific property. The text stated clearly that based on the flawless federal preservation status, the massive architectural upgrades, and the booming neighborhood commercial development, the abolitionist manor was no longer an $800 forgotten shell. Printed right there on the glossy cover for the entire world to see was the current verified market valuation: $1.5 million. I was still sitting in the driver's seat of my luxury SUV, staring at the bold print on the magazine cover, when my phone screen suddenly lit up and began to vibrate against the center console. It had been exactly 3 hours since the digital version of the architectural article went live across major social media platforms. I looked down at the glowing screen and let out a short, bitter laugh. The caller ID displayed a name that had not actively tried to reach me in over 6 months. The last time this person had contacted me directly was to agree with Trent that I was going to freeze to death in a slum. It was my mother, Brenda. I did not answer right away. I sat there listening to the phone ring, watching her name flash on the screen. I took a deep, steadying breath, bracing myself for whatever fresh manipulation was about to come through the speaker. I pressed the accept button and lifted the phone to my ear, but I remained completely silent, waiting for her to make the first move. "Simone, baby." Her voice poured through the small speaker, dripping with a sickeningly sweet tone that I had not heard directed at me since I was a very young child. It was the exact same high-pitched musical voice she used when she was trying to impress her wealthy friends at the local country club. "I knew you had it in you, my sweet girl. We are just so incredibly proud of you." I sat there gripping the leather steering wheel, absolutely stunned by her sheer, unadulterated audacity. For half a year she had allowed my sister and my brother-in-law to relentlessly cyberbully me in our family group chat. She had explicitly told me to go live like junk. She had frozen me out of her life entirely. Now she was speaking to me as if I had just won an Olympic gold medal and she had been my loving coach the entire time. "I saw the beautiful article online this morning." Brenda continued, her voice fluttering with exaggerated fake excitement. "The house looks absolutely stunning, Simone. The detail on that woodwork is just gorgeous. I told your father just the other day that you always had such a unique vision for things. We always believed in your talent even when things got a little difficult between us at that dinner. We knew you just needed some tough love to really push you out of your comfort zone so you could reach your full potential." The psychological gymnastics required to reframe kicking your own daughter out into the freezing rain as a supportive parenting tactic was truly staggering. She did not offer a single apology. She did not acknowledge the deep pain she had caused me. She just neatly and effortlessly rewrote history to make herself the supportive matriarch of a highly successful millionaire daughter. She even tried to play off the massive financial valuation printed on the cover. "We saw that silly little number they printed at the bottom of the article, too," she chuckled lightly. $1.5 million. The media always exaggerates these things, but it is still just such a wonderful blessing for our family. Our family. I caught the subtle shift in her vocabulary immediately. When I bought the house for $800, it was my massive mistake. Now that it was worth millions, it was suddenly a blessing for our family. I kept my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. "What do you want, Mom?" Brenda let out a breathless, nervous laugh, pretending my cold tone did not completely pierce her fake, joyful facade. "Oh, stop being so serious, Simone. We want to celebrate you, of course. We are throwing a massive family cookout this weekend in our backyard. Your father is already preparing to marinate the ribs, and Jasmine is putting together a beautiful balloon arch just for you. We invited all the aunts and uncles and the cousins. Everyone is just dying to see you and celebrate your massive overnight success. You absolutely have to come home this weekend, baby. We are family after all, and family sticks together." The phrase hung heavily in the air inside my quiet car. When I had a few $100s to my name and desperately needed a safe place to sleep, we were not family. When Trent was ruining his expensive Italian shoes while aggressively mocking my hard physical labor in my own living room, we were not family. When Jasmine was posting fake tearful videos online, claiming my selfishness had ruined her spiritual aura, we were definitely not family. But now that a prestigious national magazine had publicly validated my worth and broadcasted my wealth to the entire world, we were suddenly a tight-knit, loving clan again. I knew exactly who these people were, and I knew exactly how their minds operated. I knew my mother and her desperate, unending need to claim credit for anything shiny or successful. I knew Jasmine and her bottomless, agonizing greed for a luxury lifestyle she could not actually afford. And I knew Trent and his arrogant, failing crypto investments. This cookout was absolutely not a celebration of my hard work. It was a carefully coordinated ambush. They had seen the massive influx of money and the sudden public status, and they desperately wanted their piece of the pie. If I declined the invitation, Brenda would immediately spin a brand new tragic narrative to the extended family. She would call the aunts and cousins and claim that sudden wealth had changed me, making me an arrogant, ungrateful daughter who had abandoned her humble roots. I refused to give her that easy ammunition. More importantly, I refused to run from them anymore. I had spent my entire life avoiding their traps and playing small to keep the peace. I wanted to walk right through their front gate, look them directly in the eyes, and see exactly what kind of pathetic trap they thought they were clever enough to set for me. "I will be there," I said calmly, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "Send me the time." "Oh, wonderful baby," Brenda squealed, clapping her hands together through the phone. "See you Saturday." I hung up the phone before she could say another word, cutting off her fake joy. The silence in my car felt heavy with dangerous anticipation. The board was set, and the vultures were officially circling overhead. But I was no longer the naive, obedient scapegoat they had kicked out 6 months ago. I was a heavily armored asset holder, and I did not walk into blind spots. I immediately opened my contacts and dialed Malik. He picked up on the second ring, his voice calm and professional. "Malik," I said, my tone sharp and intensely focused. "My mother just called me playing the loving parent. She invited me to a massive family cookout this weekend to supposedly celebrate my magazine cover. They are planning something big, and they are going to try to corner me." Malik sighed heavily on the other end of the line. "I knew they would come crawling out of the woodwork the second that valuation went public," he said. "What do you need me to do, Simone?" "I need you to run a full, comprehensive financial background check on Trent and his real estate investment firm right now," I told him. "Dig deep into the shell companies, the tax records, the recent property transfers, and his crypto accounts. If they are willing to swallow their pride and invite me back into their house, it means they are desperate for cash. I need to know exactly how desperate they really are before I walk into that backyard." I drove straight from the bookstore to Malik and his downtown apartment. I did not want to do this over a secure phone line or a video call. I needed to see the documents with my own eyes and piece together the puzzle side by side with the only person I trusted. When I arrived, Malik already had his dining room table completely covered in printed municipal records, tax documents, and 3 different computer monitors glowing brightly in the dim room. We ordered a massive pot of black coffee and locked the door. For the next 48 hours, we barely slept. We transformed his apartment into a war room completely dedicated to dissecting the shiny fake empire of my arrogant brother-in-law. Trent had always been incredibly loud about his supposed wealth. At every Thanksgiving dinner and every Christmas morning, he would corner anyone who would listen and aggressively lecture them about his vast real estate portfolio and his genius cryptocurrency investments. He walked around our family gatherings wearing tailored Italian suits and $900 loafers, acting like he was a Wall Street titan, gracing us with his presence. He made sure everyone knew he was the brilliant CEO of a company he called Apex Capital Solutions. But as Malik and I started digging past the glossy corporate website and the fake online reviews, the polished facade immediately began to crack and crumble. We started with the basic municipal property records. Trent claimed his firm owned dozens of lucrative commercial properties downtown. Malik accessed the county clerk database, and we painstakingly traced the ownership history of every single building Trent had ever bragged about. The truth was absolutely pathetic. Apex Capital Solutions did not own those buildings outright. Trent had set up a complex web of shady shell companies registered in Delaware to mask his actual financial footprint. He was systematically purchasing properties using dangerous high-interest loans and then immediately taking out massive second and third mortgages against those exact same buildings before the ink was even dry on the first contract. He was not a brilliant real estate investor. He was running a highly leveraged, extremely illegal house of cards. He was taking out new loans just to pay the minimum interest on the old loans, constantly moving money between his shell companies to create the illusion of massive cash flow. But the real estate fraud was only the tip of the iceberg. I remembered how Trent constantly mocked my $800 historic home purchase by bragging about his cryptocurrency portfolio yielding massive passive income. Malik was a genius at tracking digital financial footprints. He managed to locate the public digital wallet addresses associated with Trent and his primary business accounts. We sat in absolute silence, staring at the glowing monitor as the transaction history loaded on the screen. Trent had not just lost a little bit of money in the digital market. He had been completely and entirely wiped out. In a desperate, arrogant attempt to become an overnight billionaire, he had taken the actual liquid cash from his real estate business loans and gambled it heavily on highly volatile, unregulated digital coins. When the crypto market inevitably crashed 6 months ago, his entire portfolio tanked to absolute zero. He had literally vaporized millions of dollars of borrowed money into thin air. I leaned back in my chair, running my hands over my tired face as the massive pieces of the puzzle finally snapped together. I thought back to that terrible rainy Sunday evening at the mahogany dining table. I thought about Jasmine sobbing hysterically because her premium credit card had been declined for a $15,000 spiritual retreat to Tulum. She had blamed the universe for testing her boundaries. My mother had blamed me for being selfish and withholding my savings. But looking at the exact dates on the digital transaction logs, I realized the absolute truth. Her credit card had not been declined because of a simple banking error or a blocked chakra. It had been declined because Trent and his firm were completely broke. They were drowning in a massive ocean of toxic debt, while continuing to lease luxury downtown lofts and buy expensive silk pajamas just to keep up appearances for Jasmine and her gullible internet followers. They were living in a state of pure financial delusion. But the final devastating piece of dirt came at 3 a.m. on our second night of digging. Malik had used his specialized access to run a deep search through the Federal Public Records database, specifically looking for any registered government actions against Apex Capital Solutions. The system loaded for a few agonizing seconds before flashing a massive red alert across the screen. Malik slowly took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, completely speechless. He turned the monitor toward me so I could read the official document for myself. It was a formal notice of federal tax lien. The document was filed directly by the Internal Revenue Service. Trent had been so busy shuffling loan money around and gambling on digital coins that he had completely stopped paying his federal corporate taxes for 3 consecutive years. The IRS had finally caught up with him. The document clearly stated that due to massive unpaid tax liabilities and suspected corporate fraud, the federal government had officially stepped in. Just 2 days ago, the IRS had executed a sweeping order to secretly freeze every single bank account associated with Trent Jasmine and their various shell companies. They were completely locked out of their own money. They could not move a single dime. I stared at the federal document, my blood running completely cold. The IRS does not play games with corporate fraud. When they freeze your accounts and file a lien of this magnitude, they are preparing to seize your assets and pursue severe criminal charges. Trent was not just facing bankruptcy. He was staring directly down the barrel of a lengthy federal prison sentence. The heavy silence in the apartment was suddenly deafening. The sickeningly sweet phone call from my mother completely replayed in my mind. The sudden invitation to a family cookout to celebrate my magazine cover. The promise of marinated ribs and a beautiful balloon arch in my honor. I looked at Malik and he looked right back at me, his expression grim and completely serious. We both realized the exact same terrifying truth at the exact same moment. Trent was entirely desperate for liquid cash to pay off the IRS and keep himself out of a federal penitentiary. His own assets were frozen, his credit was completely destroyed, and his crypto was worthless. He had absolutely nothing left to his name. But his scapegoat sister-in-law, the woman he had relentlessly mocked and told to go live in the slums, had just been publicly splashed across a national magazine cover holding the deed to a federally protected debt-free historic asset officially valued at $1.5 million. My mother had not invited me to a barbecue to celebrate my success. She had invited me to a slaughter. They were planning to corner me in that backyard, use every ounce of toxic family guilt and emotional manipulation they possessed, and trick me into signing away the equity of my historic home. They needed my house to save Trent from federal prison. Saturday afternoon arrived with clear blue skies and a warm, gentle breeze. It was the exact opposite of the freezing, violent rainstorm I had driven through the night. My family threw me out onto the street. I spent the morning at my historic Victorian home, drinking coffee on my restored mahogany porch and mentally preparing for the battlefield I was about to walk onto. I did not wear my heavy canvas work pants or my thick steel-toed boots. I wanted to send a very clear and immediate message the second I stepped out of my car. I chose a sharply tailored emerald green power suit over a crisp white silk shirt, paired with matching expensive leather heels. I looked exactly like the successful independent millionaire the National Architectural Magazine had just declared me to be. I pulled my new luxury SUV into my parents' perfectly manicured suburban driveway and put the car in park. I did not even have the chance to unbuckle my seatbelt before the circus officially began. Jasmine was already waiting for me right on the front lawn. She was fully dressed in a flowing, expensive designer summer dress, holding a portable ring light attached to her smartphone. She was actively live streaming to her thousands of followers. The second I opened my car door and stepped out onto the concrete, she hit her mark. Simone, she squealed at the top of her lungs, rushing toward me with her arms stretched wide open. She practically tackled me, throwing her arms around my neck and pulling me into a suffocating embrace. She positioned her body so that the camera captured the perfect, flattering angle of her face, while showcasing our supposed deep sisterly bond. "Hey guys!" Jasmine chirped, turning her bright, glowing face directly toward the camera lens. Her voice was pitched up an entire octave, echoing loudly down the quiet residential street. "Look who finally made it to the big celebration. My beautiful, brilliant older sister, Simone. As you all know, we are just so incredibly proud of her massive magazine cover this week. Family is absolutely everything to us, and we have supported her gorgeous historic renovation vision since day one. We are about to eat some amazing barbecue and celebrate her genius." I did not hug her back. I kept my arms resting calmly at my sides and simply stared at the camera lens with a completely blank, unbothered expression. I let her perform her desperate little internet charade without offering a single word of validation. While she was busy acting like the most supportive sibling on the planet, I looked over her shoulder and scanned my parents' property. The lies were immediately apparent. There were absolutely no extra cars parked anywhere along the street. There was no loud, cheerful music playing from the backyard. There was no smell of marinated ribs or hot dogs cooking on a grill. The massive extended family cookout that my mother Brenda had enthusiastically promised me over the phone was a complete and total phantom. There were no aunts, no uncles, and no cousins. The only piece of decoration was a pathetic, hastily assembled pastel balloon arch tied to the front porch railing, specifically placed there just so Jasmine could use it as a prop for her fake video background. Jasmine got her 15 seconds of fake sisterly love and immediately tapped the screen of her phone to end the live broadcast. The transformation was instantaneous and absolutely chilling. The moment the red recording dot disappeared from her screen, her bright glowing smile completely vanished. The fake warmth evaporated into the warm afternoon air, replaced instantly by a cold, hard scowl of deep resentment. She dropped her arms, stepped back away from me, and let out an annoyed, heavy sigh. She did not say hello. She did not say another word to me at all. She simply turned her back and marched up the driveway toward the side privacy gate that led into the backyard. I followed her, my expensive leather heels clicking slowly and deliberately against the smooth concrete driveway. I felt absolutely no fear. Knowing exactly what was waiting for me gave me an incredible sense of absolute calm. As we reached the tall wooden privacy gate, the illusion of a family gathering completely shattered. My father, Calvin, stepped out from the shadows of the garage. He moved directly into the center of the narrow concrete walkway, completely blocking the entrance to the backyard. He was wearing his casual weekend clothes, but his body language was incredibly stiff and defensive. He looked down at the ground, absolutely refusing to meet my eyes. He nervously cleared his throat and adjusted his leather belt. He looked exactly like the silent, complicit coward who had sat at the head of the mahogany dining table 6 months ago, refusing to defend his eldest daughter from being thrown out into the cold. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "Are you going to step aside and let me into the backyard, or are we having this massive family celebration right here in the driveway next to the trash cans?" Calvin swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just stood there acting as a physical human shield for the people pulling his strings. "He is not moving, Simone," a voice sneered from the dark interior of the open garage. Trent stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight, walking slowly toward me. He was wearing a dark, expensive suit, but he did not look anything like the arrogant crypto-billionaire who had strutted around my ruined parlor mocking my hard work. His physical appearance had drastically deteriorated. His face was pale and covered in a thin sheen of nervous sweat despite the comfortable weather. Deep, dark bags hung heavily under his eyes, betraying the absolute terror of a man who had not slept in days. He looked completely cornered. He looked exactly like a man who knew the federal government was actively breathing down his neck. My mother, Brenda, stepped out of the garage right behind him. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her face set in a furious, demanding glare. "There is no family cookout today, Simone," she stated coldly, completely dropping the sickeningly sweet tone she had used on the phone. "Do not act surprised. We needed to have a very private, very serious family meeting without any of the aunts or uncles causing unnecessary distractions. You owe this family a conversation." I stood my ground, looking back and forth between the three of them. Jasmine stood safely behind Trent, her phone gripped tightly in her hand. Calvin remained planted firmly in front of the gate, blocking my path forward. And Brenda stood tall, ready to unleash her usual arsenal of emotional manipulation and maternal guilt. Trent took another step toward me, reaching a shaky hand into the inner breast pocket of his dark suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, folded legal document. He smoothed the heavy paper out, holding it tightly in his sweating hands. "You have had your fun playing construction worker," Trent said, trying desperately to project his usual mocking authority. But his voice cracked noticeably under the immense invisible pressure crushing his chest. "You got your little magazine cover and your 15 minutes of internet fame. But the games are over, Simone. It is time for you to stop acting selfish and handle real adult business for the sake of this family." He held the legal document out toward me, the crisp white paper glaring in the afternoon sun. I did not reach out to take it. I just looked at his trembling hands, waiting for him to dig his own grave. Trent marched past Calvin and slapped the heavy legal document down onto a plastic folding table that had been set up near the side door of the garage. I walked over and looked down at the crisp white paper. The bold black letters at the very top of the page clearly read, "Quitclaim Deed." Brenda immediately stepped up beside him, crossing her arms and lifting her chin. She started weaving a web of absolute delusion right there in the driveway. She told me that because I was living under her roof when I purchased the abandoned property, the money I used was technically family money. She completely ignored the fact that I was paying her $2,000 a month in rent, keeping her own mortgage afloat. She claimed that by buying the house, I had selfishly diverted crucial resources away from my sister during her time of deep spiritual need. Therefore, she argued my family was legally and morally entitled to a massive share of the current $1.5 million valuation. Trent leaned heavily against the table, tapping the paper with his index finger. He tried his absolute best to sound like a seasoned financial advisor, but his voice was shaking, betraying his sheer desperation. He told me that coming into sudden wealth was incredibly dangerous for someone with my profound lack of business experience. He generously offered to take the heavy burden completely off my shoulders. He demanded that I sign the deed immediately, transferring exactly 50% of my entire property equity directly into a corporate LLC managed entirely by Jasmine. He claimed this was a necessary strategic move to shield me from massive sudden federal tax liabilities. I did not get angry. I did not raise my voice or try to logically defend my hard work to people committed to stealing it. I simply reached out and picked up the heavy legal document. I read the name of Jasmine and her LLC printed clearly on the ownership transfer line. Then I slowly lifted my head and looked Trent dead in his bloodshot, panicked eyes. "Are you absolutely sure you want to involve Jasmine and her LLC in a $1 million real estate transfer, Trent?" I asked, my voice cutting through the warm afternoon air like a sharp blade. "Because that seems like a massive legal risk, considering the IRS completely froze all of its assets on Tuesday morning." The effect of my words was instantaneous and absolutely catastrophic. The silence that followed was so profound, I could hear the gentle rustling of the leaves in the oak trees above us. Then the entire fake illusion completely exploded. Jasmine dropped her smartphone onto the concrete driveway, the glass screen shattering loudly. She lunged forward, grabbing Trent fiercely by the lapels of his dark suit. "What did she just say?" Jasmine screamed, her voice completely hysterical. "What do you mean, frozen, Trent? Where is all of my money?" Trent physically recoiled from his wife, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He stammered wildly, trying to tell her that I was just a bitter, jealous liar, making things up to ruin their perfect marriage. But the sheer, naked terror in his eyes gave him away completely. He looked exactly like a rat trapped in a corner with no way out. Brenda realized that the massive payday they had meticulously planned was rapidly dissolving right in front of her. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. She lunged toward me, reaching out with her manicured hands, trying to aggressively grab my arm to physically stop me from leaving. "How dare you come into my house and spread vicious lies about your brother-in-law?" she shrieked. I easily sidestepped her desperate grasp. I did not let her touch me. I simply let the quitclaim deed slip from my fingers, watching it flutter harmlessly to the concrete floor right next to Jasmine and her shattered phone. I turned my back on the screaming, chaotic mess of my family and walked calmly down the driveway. I climbed into my luxury SUV, locked the heavy doors, and reversed out into the street, leaving them completely to their own destruction. But a cornered, desperate animal is always the most dangerous. Trent knew he was entirely out of time and out of options. The IRS was actively breathing down his neck, and he needed a massive asset to liquidate immediately to save himself from a federal penitentiary. Since he could not trick me into giving him the house, he decided to use his shady corporate connections to legally steal it. The very next morning, I was standing in my fully restored front parlor enjoying a cup of coffee when I heard heavy, aggressive footsteps marching up my wooden porch stairs. I walked to the stained glass transom window and looked outside. A man in a cheap gray suit holding a thick clipboard was standing directly at my solid oak door. Before I could even turn the deadbolt, the man slapped a massive, bright neon orange sticker directly onto the center of my freshly painted front door. He quickly turned around and practically ran back down the steps to his idling city vehicle, speeding away down the street before I could open the door and ask him a single question. I stepped out onto the porch and stared at the glowing orange paper. The bold black letters at the top read, official stop work order, and notice of impending property seizure. I ripped the paper off the wood and read the fine print, my blood boiling with every single word. Trent had used a corrupt insider connection at the city zoning office to completely bypass standard procedures and file an emergency blight violation against my home. But he did not stop there. Attached to the violation was a fake eminent domain petition filed directly by his shady shell company, Apex Capital Solutions. In the petition, Trent outright lied to the city government. He claimed that despite the cosmetic exterior upgrades, my internal renovations were structurally catastrophic and posed an immediate severe physical hazard to the surrounding Heritage District community. He stated that the structural integrity of the foundation was completely compromised due to my lack of professional contracting oversight. He was officially petitioning the City Council to seize my property under emergency public safety laws and transfer the deed directly to his reputable firm so he could properly manage the dangerous asset. He was literally trying to use fraudulent municipal paperwork to rip my historic home right out of my hands. He knew that if he could just get the city council to hand him the title, he could instantly use the $1.5 million valuation as massive collateral to pay off his IRS tax liens and keep himself out of prison. He thought because I was just a single, independent woman, I would completely panic at the sight of an official government seizure notice and fold under the immense legal pressure. He thought I would be entirely crushed by the weight of City Hall. He had absolutely no idea that I had spent the last 6 months making myself completely legally bulletproof. I read the fine print at the bottom of the glowing orange sticker and realized exactly how tight the trap was designed to be. I was given exactly 48 hours to appear in person at a mandatory public city council zoning hearing. The document stated that if I failed to provide comprehensive proof of structural compliance, the city would immediately seize the property under emergency safety protocols. They would not put the house on the open market for a fair valuation. They would place it in an expedited, closed-door municipal auction. And I knew exactly who the only registered bidder at that corrupt private auction would be. Trent had set up a completely rigged game using his shady connections to snatch my $1.5 million asset in a matter of days. As I stood on the porch holding the ridiculous seizure notice, my phone began to vibrate violently in my canvas pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the bright screen. It was Jasmine. She was calling me directly for the first time in 6 months. I did not press accept. I stood in the quiet morning air, leaning against my restored mahogany door frame, and watched the screen ring until it finally went to voicemail. Less than a minute later, a new audio message notification popped up. I tapped play and lifted the phone to my ear. Jasmine was not using her high-pitched musical influencer voice, and she was not trying to perform for a digital audience. She was sobbing hysterically. Her voice was raw and thick with genuine, absolute panic. "Simone, please," she wept heavily into the phone. "You have to help us. Trent told me everything about the IRS and the frozen accounts. We have absolutely zero money left. The bank is foreclosing on our luxury loft by the end of the week, and Trent is facing serious federal charges. He could go to federal prison, Simone. I will be completely ruined, and I will have to move back into Mom and Dad's basement. Please just sign the house over to his LLC so he can leverage the equity and pay off the tax lien. You can just buy another cheap house later. You are so good at fixing things. Please, Simone, family makes sacrifices for family. I am begging you." The sheer unadulterated entitlement radiating from the voicemail was almost physically repulsive. Family makes sacrifices for family. When Jasmine wanted to go on a $15,000 vacation to Mexico, my family demanded that I sacrifice my entire life savings to fund her delusion. When I refused, they sacrificed me by throwing me out into a freezing rainstorm without a second thought. Now that her husband had committed massive federal financial fraud and gambled their entire life away, they expected me to sacrifice my multi-million-dollar empire to keep him out of a jail cell. She honestly believed that my entire existence was meant to be a disposable safety net for her terrible life choices. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for her. I tapped the screen and permanently saved the audio file to my secure cloud backup. I walked back inside my beautiful restored parlor and opened my laptop. I called Malik and told him the exact time and location of the emergency zoning hearing. We did not panic. We simply went to work. I spent the next several hours downloading the massive compiled dossier of Trent and his fraudulent business practices. I copied the IRS federal tax lien documents, the complex shell company ownership structures, and his completely drained cryptocurrency logs onto a secure silver flash drive. I carefully added my Federal Historic Registry certification and my fully approved municipal grant paperwork to the drive. I safely tucked the silver flash drive into my heavy leather briefcase. Then I walked upstairs to my massive custom-built walk-in closet. I bypassed the casual clothes and the heavy canvas work gear I had worn for months. I pulled out a striking tailored crimson-red power suit. It was bold, aggressive, and commanded absolute attention. Trent and my mother wanted to use their corrupt local connections to drag me into a brutal public arena. They wanted a public fight to humiliate me, intimidate me, and legally steal my property. I smiled, staring at my reflection in the full-length mirror. They wanted a fight, but they were about to get an absolute massacre. 48 hours later, I pushed open the heavy solid oak doors of the municipal city hall chambers. The massive room was brightly lit with harsh fluorescent lights and smelled faintly of old floor wax and cheap coffee. The public gallery was packed with local residents, journalists, and city officials attending the weekly legislative session. I walked down the center aisle, my crimson heels clicking rhythmically against the polished terrazzo floor. I felt the eyes of the entire room immediately turn toward me, but my gaze was locked dead ahead. Trent was already standing at the primary speaker podium, facing the raised, curved desk of the city council. He had completely abandoned his flashy tailored vests and his expensive designer accessories. Today he was wearing a cheap, poorly fitted gray suit meant to make him look like a humble, hard-working civic developer. He gripped the edges of the wooden podium tightly, his knuckles turning white, trying desperately to project a calm authority that he absolutely did not possess. I could see a thin layer of nervous sweat glistening on the back of his neck. Sitting directly behind him in the front row of the public gallery was my entire toxic family. Brenda, Calvin, and Jasmine sat shoulder to shoulder, acting as a united front of moral support for the man who was actively trying to defraud the federal government. Jasmine had her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes red and puffy from crying, but she still glared at me with sheer hostile entitlement as I walked past. Brenda lifted her chin and narrowed her eyes, trying to intimidate me with the same cold, maternal glare she had used to control me my entire life. Calvin just looked down at his lap, completely unable to meet my eyes in a public setting. I did not break my stride. I walked directly to the opposing podium and set my leather briefcase down on the polished wood. The city council president struck his heavy wooden gavel against the sound block, calling the emergency zoning session to order. He instructed Trent to state his formal case for the expedited blight violation and the immediate property seizure. Trent leaned into the microphone and cleared his throat. He launched into a completely fabricated, incredibly confident pitch. He signaled a clerk to project a massive photograph of my house onto the digital screens behind the council members. But it was not a current photograph of the restored Victorian gem. It was a picture taken months ago when the house was still completely covered in rusted scaffolding, missing half of its roof and surrounded by mud. Esteemed council members, Trent began, his voice echoing loudly through the silent chamber. I stand before you today, representing Apex Capital Solutions, a highly reputable commercial development firm deeply committed to the safety and prosperity of this great city. It breaks my heart to report that the property in question is an absolute public hazard. The current owner is a completely inexperienced amateur who has compromised the foundational integrity of the historic structure. It is a severe physical danger to the residents of the upcoming Heritage District. My firm is willing to absorb the massive financial burden of seizing this property immediately, either to safely demolish it or properly rebuild it for the absolute good of the community. We are simply asking the council to expedite the transfer of the deed today to prevent a catastrophic collapse. He spoke with such practiced slimy conviction that several of the council members actually nodded along in agreement, completely unaware of the massive financial fraud standing right in front of them. Trent finished his pitch and stepped back from the microphone, crossing his arms with a smug, arrogant smirk on his face. He looked over at me as if he had already won the war and secured his escape from prison. The council president shuffled his thick stack of paperwork and turned his attention to my podium. "Miss Simone," he said, speaking formally into his microphone, "you have been issued a direct emergency blight violation and an impending seizure notice by a concerned local developer. How do you respond to these severe structural allegations brought forward by Mr. Trent and his firm?" I slowly unzipped my leather briefcase. I did not rush. I took my secure silver flash drive out and placed it gently on the podium. I looked directly at Trent, watching his smug smirk falter just a fraction under my calm gaze. Then I looked up at the council president. I leaned into my microphone, completely unbothered by the heavy tension suffocating the room. "I actually agree with Mr. Trent," I said, my voice perfectly steady and carrying clearly across the massive chamber. "I believe the community deserves absolute transparency and rigorous structural safety. It is incredibly important to know exactly who is managing the historic assets of this city, which is exactly why I brought the actual director of the Municipal Heritage Committee with me today." Right on cue, the heavy double doors at the back of the municipal chamber swung open. Malik stepped through the threshold wearing an impeccably tailored navy blue suit, looking every bit the senior city official that he was. He was pushing a sleek metal utility cart down the polished center aisle directly toward my podium. Stacked neatly on the cart were thick-bound municipal ledgers and a series of heavy embossed folders. The entire room went completely silent watching him approach. Trent gripped the edges of his podium so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. He stared at Malik with wide, panicked eyes, clearly realizing that he had completely underestimated exactly who he was dealing with. Malik parked the cart next to me and handed me the first embossed folder. I opened it and pulled out a heavy sheet of official parchment, completely covered in gold federal stamps and raised municipal seals. I handed it directly to the city clerk, who walked it up to the raised desk of the council president. "Mr. Trent just stood here and confidently told you that my property is a public hazard managed by an amateur," I said, projecting my voice clearly through the microphone. "That document you are holding is the official certification from the Federal Register of Historic Places. My property, the Jeremiah Sterling Abolitionist Manor, was formally recognized and federally protected 2 weeks ago. Furthermore, my structural blueprints and renovation timelines have already been rigorously inspected and fully approved by this very city." I handed a second stack of documents to the clerk. "These are the records of the $450,000 historic preservation grant I was awarded by the Municipal Development Board." I continued. "They include certified engineering reports proving the foundation is structurally flawless. Mr. Trent did not file this emergency blight violation to protect the Heritage District. He filed it because his firm has absolutely zero legal standing to touch a federally protected landmark, and he needed a corrupt backdoor to steal my land." The council president quickly flipped through the gold-stamped documents, his face turning bright red as he realized the sheer magnitude of the lie Trent had just tried to sell them. He glared down at Trent, who was now sweating profusely, pulling nervously at the collar of his cheap gray suit. Mr. Trent, the president, barked, his voice echoing sharply through the chamber. "Are you actively attempting to use this council to bypass federal preservation laws and illegally seize protected private property?" Trent stammered wildly, leaning into his microphone. "No, Your Honor. I mean, Mr. President, there has been a massive misunderstanding. My firm was simply acting on preliminary visual inspections. We were trying to be proactive for the community. I did not let him breathe. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the thick stack of financial documents printed from Malik and his apartment. I pulled out the secure silver flash drive and handed the entire bundle to the clerk. I am not finished, I said, cutting Trent off completely. In the absolute interest of public transparency, I am officially submitting these documents into the public record to provide full context regarding the true motivations of Apex Capital Solutions. The chamber grew incredibly quiet as I listed his financial crimes out loud for everyone to hear. I explained that Apex Capital Solutions was nothing but a fraudulent shell company deeply drowning in toxic leveraged debt. I read the exact dates his cryptocurrency accounts tanked to absolute zero. And then I delivered the final, devastating kill shot. I instructed the council president to look at the very last document in the stack. As you can clearly see, I announced, my voice steady and completely relentless. Mr. Trent is currently under active investigation by the federal government. On Tuesday morning, the Internal Revenue Service placed a massive federal tax lien on his firm and secretly froze every single one of his personal and business accounts. He is not a civic hero trying to save a neighborhood. He is a completely desperate broke man attempting to use a fraudulent municipal petition to steal a $1.5 million debt-free asset just to keep himself out of a federal penitentiary. The entire chamber absolutely erupted. The public gallery gasped loudly, and several local journalists sitting in the back row immediately stood up, pointing their recording phones directly at Trent. The council president violently slammed his wooden gavel against the block, repeatedly shouting for order over the massive uproar. He pointed a furious, shaking finger down at Trent, loudly declaring that the city would be launching an immediate criminal investigation into his fraudulent zoning filings and contacting federal authorities. Trent completely snapped. The invisible, crushing pressure he had been hiding all week finally broke him right in half. He did not try to defend himself to the furious city council. He did not try to logically explain his massive financial crimes. Instead, he spun around away from the podium and pointed a violently shaking finger directly at Jasmine, who was sitting in the front row of the gallery. "This is your fault, you pathetic leech!" he screamed at the absolute top of his lungs, his voice echoing wildly over the sound of the banging gavel. "You and your endless luxury demands. You needed the designer bags. You needed the $15,000 fake spiritual retreats. You bled me completely dry and forced me to take those risky loans to pay for your ridiculous internet aesthetic. You ruined my life." Jasmine leaped out of her seat, her face contorted in absolute horror. She burst into loud, ugly, hysterical tears right there in the front row. "You promised me you were a millionaire," she shrieked back at him, her voice cracking violently. "You lied to me. I am going to lose my loft because of you." It was an absolute spectacular implosion. The flawless, wealthy aesthetic they had spent years carefully curating on the internet was completely shredded to pieces in a harsh, fluorescent-lit municipal building. Brenda jumped up from her seat, her face flushed dark with sheer mortification. For a woman whose entire existence revolved around projecting a perfect image to the country club, this public screaming match was her absolute worst nightmare. She grabbed Jasmine by the arm, digging her manicured nails into her daughter, pulling her aggressively toward the aisle. "Stop it right now," Brenda hissed furiously, trying desperately to quiet them down while glaring at the journalists recording the entire meltdown. "Everyone is watching us. You are embarrassing the entire family. Shut your mouths and walk to the car immediately." Calvin remained completely frozen in his chair, staring blankly straight ahead, absolutely refusing to look at his screaming son-in-law or his hysterical weeping daughter. He was the exact same silent coward he had always been, entirely paralyzed by the chaos he had allowed his wife to create. I stood at my podium and watched the people who had terrorized, manipulated, and discarded me completely tear each other apart. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel the need to step in and save them from the exact mess they had arrogantly created for themselves. I had given them every opportunity to leave me alone, and they had actively chosen war. I calmly gathered my empty folders from the polished wood. I neatly snapped the heavy brass clasps of my leather briefcase shut. I nodded respectfully to Malik and the still furious council president. Then I turned around and walked confidently down the center aisle, my crimson heels clicking over the sound of my family and their public destruction. I walked out of the heavy double doors into the bright afternoon sunlight, leaving them all behind me forever. The fallout from the City Hall meeting was swift and absolutely merciless. The federal government does not play games when it comes to massive corporate tax evasion and wire fraud. Within 3 weeks, Trent was formally indicted on multiple felony counts. Local news channels broadcasted humiliating footage of federal agents carrying dozens of heavy cardboard boxes and computer servers out of the Apex Capital Solutions downtown office. Trent was officially facing up to 15 years in a federal penitentiary, and his arrogant crypto bro persona completely vanished behind the terrifying reality of his impending criminal trial. Because Trent had completely drained all of their liquid cash trying to cover his bad investments, Jasmine was left with absolutely nothing. The bank immediately seized their luxury downtown loft and repossessed her expensive leased sports car. Her fake digital influencer empire collapsed overnight. Her followers quickly discovered the truth about her fraudulent wealth, and the comment sections on her videos turned into a relentless flood of mockery. She was forced to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy and sell off her designer silk pajamas and expensive handbags just to afford a mediocre defense attorney for her husband. With nowhere else to go, she had to pack her remaining belongings into garbage bags and move directly back into my parents' house. The poetic justice of her situation was almost too perfect to believe. Jasmine, the golden child, who had cried over a $15,000 spiritual retreat to Tulum, was forced to move down into the exact same drafty, unfinished concrete basement that Brenda and Calvin had kicked me out of 6 months prior. I heard through Malik, who still had connections with some of my extended family, that Jasmine was constantly complaining about the freezing cold floors and the severe lack of natural light. Brenda was so utterly humiliated by her golden child falling from grace and the massive public scandals surrounding her son-in-law that she completely stopped attending her weekly country club brunches. She isolated herself in that manicured suburban house, entirely trapped in a miserable, toxic prison of her own making. About a month after the City Hall incident, the dust had finally started to settle. I was standing in my grand entryway organizing some fabric swatches for a new client when I heard a slow, hesitant knock at my front door. I looked through the antique side glass panel and saw Calvin standing on my restored mahogany porch. He looked incredibly small, and at least 10 years older than the last time I saw him. His shoulders were completely slumped, and he kept wringing his hands nervously together. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt and pulled the massive oak door open. He did not look me in the eye at first. He stared down at his shoes and muttered a quiet hello before immediately launching into a pathetic rehearsed speech. He told me that Jasmine was severely depressed living down in the basement. He said the space was entirely too cramped and that the damp air was completely ruining her fragile mental health. He shifted his weight awkwardly and then had the absolute unmitigated gall to ask if Jasmine could move into one of the massive spare bedrooms in my historic home. He tried to appeal to my sense of duty, telling me that she was my little sister and that I had more than enough space and wealth to share with her until Trent beat his federal charges. I stood perfectly still in my beautiful warm entryway. I looked at the man who had sat silently at a dining table cutting his steak, while his wife threw me into a freezing rainstorm. I looked at the man who had physically blocked me from entering a backyard so his son-in-law could try to legally steal my property. I looked him dead in his tired, defeated eyes. "This house is for family. Dad," I said, my voice completely calm and entirely devoid of any warmth. "You taught me years ago that I was not part of it." I did not wait for him to respond. I did not want to hear another empty excuse or another manipulative plea. I firmly pushed the heavy custom oak door shut right in his face. I listened to the solid metallic click of the deadbolt, locking, sliding into place, effectively locking him out of my life forever. I turned around, and walked back into my beautiful, sunlit parlor without a single ounce of regret. Fast forward, exactly 1 year later. The abolitionist manor is completely finished, and it is an absolute architectural triumph. The commercial real estate market in the new Heritage District completely exploded just as Malik had predicted. My initial $800 investment is now officially appraised at a staggering $2.5 million. But I have absolutely no intention of ever putting this house on the market. The massive front parlor with its hand-carved mahogany wainscoting and original herringbone brick fireplaces now serves as the official headquarters for my very own historic preservation firm. I am no longer a solo consultant working in the shadows trying to prove my worth to people who do not value me. I employ a brilliant, dedicated team of young, ambitious Black architects and interior designers. We specialize in identifying, securing, and protecting forgotten historic properties in marginalized neighborhoods across the entire state. We sit around massive drafting tables bathed in the vibrant, colorful light of the 19th century stained glass window building, real generational wealth and preserving our history. Malik is a constant fixture at the house, officially consulting as a senior partner on our largest municipal projects. We built a beautiful, chosen family within these strong brick walls, based entirely on mutual respect, genuine support, and a shared vision. This morning, I woke up early as the sun was just beginning to rise over the city skyline. I poured myself a hot cup of premium dark roast coffee and walked out onto my sweeping wraparound porch. The neighborhood is alive with positive energy and the sounds of fresh development. My phone is perfectly quiet. There are no toxic family group chats demanding my money. There are no passive-aggressive guilt trips waiting in my inbox. There is only absolute, unshakable peace. My family tried to bury me under $800 of dirt, completely failing to realize that I was the solid foundation. They pushed me out into the cold and inadvertently forced me to build my own massive empire from the ground up. If you have ever been the family scapegoat, if you have ever been used, manipulated, and discarded by the people who were supposed to unconditionally protect you, I want you to remember this story. Your massive, undeniable success is the absolute best revenge. It is the only closure you will ever need. Drop a comment below if you have ever had to cut the dead weight out of your life to build your own empire. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that sometimes losing your toxic family is the exact plot twist you need to finally win. Thank you so much for listening to my journey, and remember to always protect your peace.